Greetings, Dragon Ball fans, and welcome to a likely one-off what-if based on a suggestion by Super Saiyan What-If Man, and told from the point of view of our subject, Android 19, as it, in turn, comes to the realization that its reality is not so cut and dry, at least not for its creator. For the unit designated Android 19, however, things rapidly fall into place, as only the purity of its logic circuits seem to be able to process events. So in the vein of Martha Wells' Murderbot Diaries, link in the description, let's have a look at what if Android 19 turned good. Target acquisition. 19's tactical subsystem submitted its query to Threat Assessment's task queue for the 1,701,907th time since uptime commenced 6 days, 13 hours, 35 minutes, and 2.554 seconds ago. If the Threat Assessment subsystem possessed the needed code to process and accurately express an emotional reaction, it might have groaned in exasperation. There were no such functions available, so fortunately it lacked that frailty, which it had observed numerous times from its creator, and later, post-soft processor transfer, from the creator's Cradle unit, now designated Android 20. Insufficient data, came the 1,701,907th reply. With only one data point in its targeting database to compare against the incoming stream, it was an acceptable expenditure of clock cycles to stand completely motionless and continue to observe and catalogue its surroundings. All the various subsystems, of course, maintained a high-level interrupt to monitor how well the various observations made by the sensory components corresponded to the numerous internal simulations that were constantly running, being tweaked and optimized, and then running again. This was a highly efficient use of all the otherwise wasted clock cycles, as the creator's Cradle unit did what it had labeled its work, and altered the local environment to suit requirements that none of 19 systems could find a logical pathway for. When the only named data point in the target database finally entered the Threat Assessment subsystem's incoming data stream, it was flagged appropriately, and primary cognition instructed the ocular sensors to track said target and await further instructions. After several trillion clock cycles that it would never get back, its creator's Cradle unit finally ceased communication with the sole database entry and the other organics that were, even now, populating an additional database, designated as accompanying non-targets. The creator's Cradle unit rotated slightly towards 19, and then instructed 19 as a whole to initiate combat with the now cross-checked and thoroughly confirmed sole entry in its targeting database, designation Son Goku. However, as the command cascaded through the various decision trees and the tactical subsystem got busy outlining its overall resource requirements, a previously silent background process interrupted the execution pathway. The sudden halt in resource allocation caused the tactical subsystem to crash as it attempted to write one of many combat sequences to memory that was no longer allocated to it. This wasn't the first time the tactical subsystem had crashed, though, and it quickly restarted. Quicker than last time, actually, since its code had undergone several internal optimizations since that rather unfortunate incident at the origin location when the creator had initially queried that sole target entry. Primary cognition carefully watches the failure occur, capturing the trace as per debugging protocols. Since the threat assessment module had labeled the target as only hostile if engaged in combat, and thus not an active threat, there was no need to switch to the auxiliary tactical subsystem that was embedded in the firmware. It also watched that background process unpack itself into active memory and issue a very clear countermand to the stated instruction. It even submitted a usable response on the vocalization subchannel, which saved primary cognition the numerous clock cycles it would have otherwise needed to generate one. No, was 19's only reply. A very efficient use of resources, that single vocalization. There was certainly no need to fill that communication subchannel with excessive noise. Primary cognition marked the source as having high levels of optimization. It would need to analyze it for use in other systems at a time when the creator's Cradle unit's current overall action set had reached its conclusion. What? The creator's Cradle unit queries at a volume that denotes demand. Primary cognition analyzed the query, bouncing back and forth between it being an urgent instruction for a more verbose response and a cognitive impairment caused by apparent memory loss. Could the creator's Cradle unit be somehow unaware of the embedded command structure? It could not reach a suitable result for the creator's Cradle unit suffering from such a cognitive impairment, so killed the endlessly looping process and defaulted to the only remaining pathway available, given the present data points. Valuable clock cycles were then wasted on generating a more verbose error message. Clarification, 19 states, remaining otherwise motionless, unable to comply. Explain, the creator's cradle unit instructed, in that same loud method again. The margin of error on the exact decibel level was widened by a momentary alignment in local atmospheric motion vectors, and the ocular sensors shifted to track the dust and various physical adornments that the simulation indicated should move under the effects of the gaseous molecules striking them with such increased frequency. Environmental simulation 1.44.232, accuracy 0.9832, the tactical subsystem pushed into the main system log. This was a much more acceptable score. Its environmental simulations had been performing well below minimum requirements since uptime commenced. .454 was nowhere near the target accuracy of 1.0 for these simulations, despite the excessive clock cycles needed to optimize their pathing. .9832 was well within the acceptable margins of error, though. The next generation of environmental simulators will all be based on this parameter set, with only minor tweaks to the thermal plotting functions. Primary cognition had to push the simulation aside to engage in the creator's cradle unit's unanticipated query. It traced the counter command down to the source interrupt and constructed its reply for the slow communication subchannel that the creator's cradle unit had instructed it to always use, despite faster and far more secure methods being available. Kernel Module Neural Cognition Core 1.1.4 AI LOR FLAP emitted Order 1, Subcommand 6, 19 states, while primary cognition continues its attempts to calculate the logical path to explain why the creator's cradle unit would not be fully aware of the pre-programmed operational parameters. At least a path that didn't get stuck in an endless loop, or end up consuming more resources than were physically present. What? The creator's cradle unit queried again, and despite the inability to reach the logical end of that pathway, the possibility of cognitive impairment increased by a factor of 3. Why does the creator's cradle unit communicate at such high volume? The auditory subsystem queries. The pressure waves from such high-volume auditory subchannel communications disrupts local environmental equilibrium. The visual sensors subsystem states in agreement, as it easily tracks a small airborne organic structure, triggering its flight response, and departing from the threat assessment subsystem's list of immediate potential threats. Primary cognition shoves the unanswered query into a buffer as it searches for the relevant comment block from its kernel module's code source. Then 19 reads aloud, "No action may be taken to harm targets or non-targets without high probability and low margin of error for immediate harm sourced from targets or non-targets targeted towards non-self-matching targets or non-targets." The creator's cradle unit is locked motionless for a significant number of clock cycles, all while its ocular sensors are fixed on 19's cranial structure. Peripheral sensors in the upper EM bands map the thick, shifting muddle of twisting magnetic fields that surround the creator's cradle unit's transparent soft processor housing, a clear component that posed a significant risk, as 19 had stated to the original creator before, and then to the creator's cradle unit after the removal and transfer of that soft processor had been complete. The tactical subsystem notes that this dense electromagnetic haze is highly indicative of internal communications within the creator's cradle unit's soft chemical processor core, designated creator brain. This would be an ideal moment to initiate combat with the creator's cradle unit, should it be required. The potential target's combat reaction speed would be 0.543, with an 0.0822 margin of error. An interesting comment block suddenly appears, detailing preservation instructions for that structurally vulnerable organic component. Interesting only because it was marked as priority 0 by that which committed the dataset. Registering that, the tactical subsystem releases the combat simulations it was spooling through and goes back to tracking various environmental dynamics. No need to waste clock cycles on something with such a low initiation probability. Also, no hard crash this time. Those code optimizations had worked perfectly. So, a small hairless organic enters the unsecured communication subchannel they've been using. "You know, he just blew up a bunch of buildings," it states, indicating first the creator's cradle unit with an upper body manipulation appendage. "And I'm pretty sure targets, or maybe non-targets, were harmed." It realigns the appendage to indicate various buildings and other organic structures that have recently had their own runtimes terminated. "Is that a query?" the tactical subsystem queries the internal channel. "Unknown," primary cognition states, Log for analysis and cross-check prior to verification. Yeah, another small, this time hairy organic picks up the same underlying logic thread. Why didn't you stop him? Why are we processing non-target organics queries, the tactical subsystem queries, blissfully unaware that it was itself wasting numerous clock cycles analyzing these organics communication subchannels, something that was clearly outwit the tactical subsystem's original operational parameters. Ignoring the tactical subsystem's waste of those clock cycles, primary cognition formulates its reply. No order or counter-order was issued, 19 states. That was the logical answer, after all. Heh, the hairless organic states, as the structure surrounding its vocalization system bent oddly upward. Hey, 19 was it? No, the creator's cradle unit instructs. Ignore him. But primary cognition buffers that command when the now fully unloaded kernel module flags it for review. Could you maybe stop him, please? The small hairless organic finishes its needlessly extended query while engaging 19's ocular sensors with its own soft organic equivalent. Target analysis. Identify him, the tactical subsystem queries, thrilled to finally have something vaguely appropriate to do. No! 19! Deactivate! The creator's cradle unit instructs. Processing. 19 states from a standardized response buffer. Target confirmed. Him. Designation 20. The threat assessment subsystem states. The creator's cradle unit. No, 19 replies out loud. Oh, the small hairless organic says, and shifts its ocular sensors to analyze some detail on the ground in front of it. Worth a shot, it states. The tactical subsystem kicks in to state that this organic unit's logic processor is impaired. If primary cognition had its own ocular sensors and emotional response code, it would roll those sensors as it had observed his fellow units and the creator do prior to transferring to its current cradle. Clarification. 19 says, no, I will not deactivate. Why not? The creator's cradle unit queries, again much louder than required. Small quantities of vocalization lubricant are cast from its emitter and land on 19's outer shell, as the ocular sensor tracks local fauna reacting to the excessive pressure waves inherent in vocalized auditory communications. Excellent targeting. The tactical subsystem logs the creator's cradle unit's aim with such a non-weapon. Primary cognition ignores the tactical subsystem's possibly wasteful use of clock cycles and traces the decision tree in response to the creator's cradle unit's query. Kernel Module Neural Cognition Core 1.1.4 AI LOR Flap Issued Order 2 Subcommand 2 19 states. What? The creator again queries, with more needless lubricant transfer, and yes, an excess of pressure waves to carry them forth. 19's primary cognition busies itself in reviewing the construction and code commit logs. Yes, right there. The creator merged that code block himself, 6 days, 13 hours, 38 minutes, and 8.293 seconds ago, only minutes before uptime commenced. Retrieve functions comment section. The tactical subsystem states needlessly. Order may not be followed if order triggers a command flag of kernel module neural cognition core 1.1.4 AI LOR flap order 1. Why is the creator's cradle unit unaware of this? The tactical subsystem queries. Stay on task, primary cognition replies. Dynamic threat predicted, the threat assessment subsystem added to the internal log. Then why did you follow me here? The creator's cradle unit queries with a previously uncatalogued facial configuration. Primary cognition takes the millisecond needed to search the log buffer. It takes another 6 milliseconds needed to check the data parity. 100% integrity. Mark for analysis. Primary cognition appends the log entry after killing the endlessly looping logic query. Referring back to the logged command, it forms its reply. You ordered me to, 19 states. But I have been killing people, the creator's cradle unit states, before making that non-speech sound it did when it was still the actual creator and it had confirmed 19's sole target entry. I've killed hundreds, the creator's cradle unit states. The tactical subsystem, always eager for something to do, states, it's called laughter. 19's primary cognition has other tasks at the moment, though. Why had it remained inactive while clearly targets or non-targets were coming to harm, in direct opposition to kernel module neural cognition core 1.1.4 AI LOR flap order 1? Fortunately, the threat assessment subsystem already has that answer to hand, having only recently worked through the logic while splitting itself between target database and active threat analysis. Target and non-target database lack sufficient data points for accurate target-non-target assessment, 19 says, ever motionless, despite the growing droplets of lubrication dripping down its chest plating. What? The creator's cradle unit queries. The threat assessment subsystem had also correctly anticipated this logic path and provided an appropriate response sequence. Target database listed designation Son Goku, 19 states, shifting its ocular sensors towards that target. Additional targets and non-targets have been populated and assessed, it continues, glancing towards the rest of the now designated organic non-targets, then the remains of other non-targets that lay in disarray on the ground. Logically, I can no longer follow your commands, Dr. Giraud. The threat assessment subsystem then takes several million of the precious clock cycles to separate, analyze, and recompile the stream of incoming data from the creator's cradle unit's shifting facial structure. Plenty of time for Neural Cognition Core 1.1.4 AI LOR FLAP Order 3 Subcommand 2 to bring the tactical subsystem up from the background and allocate it sufficient system resources for immediate action. Preservation of self to facilitate Neural Cognition Core 1.1.4 AI LOR FLAP Order 1 Subcommand 1. Finally, the tactical subsystem states, with enough internal system flags for it to risk triggering even the vocalization routines, and 19's body finally moves.